journalist writing for Hamodia, is here with us today and is sitting behind. She's here today as a journalist and a member of my delegation. Rivka Junger and I have something in common. This morning, for the very first time in our lives, we visited the memorial site of Auschwitz-Birkenau, the grave site of countless of her family. I, as the descendant of a generation of perpetrators, and she, as the descendant of a generation of victims. Words fail to describe the sadness and the sorrow. Sadness and sorrow even stronger than when I visit the concentration camp of Mauthausen, very close to my hometown for the first time. Never in my entire life I have felt so small, so helpless and so overwhelmed. Small, helpless and overwhelmed against the monstrosity of the atrocities and crimes committed here. And I have to admit, I feel shame. Rivka, I wish to thank you for sharing the experience with me. Dear Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, an experience that makes one thing very clear. The Holocaust was nothing abstract. It was not something that happened somewhere obscure by people that came out of nowhere. Standing at the end of the ramp in Birkenau, a friend of mine once said, is when you realize that these very train tracks lead back to train stations in our cities, lead back to the streets of our towns, villages, and neighborhoods, back into the capillaries of our societies, and thus back to where the killing began. We cannot, and we will not, avoid responsibility. I am extremely grateful to have had the privilege to listen to survivors and to listen to descendants of the victims, like Hanna Lessing, the Secretary General of the Austrian National Fund for Victims of the National Socialism. Her grandmother, too, was murdered in Auschwitz. And I am glad that she is with me here today. But it's not only about listening, it's also about understanding and translating these conversations into relevant political action. For too many years, Austria has been comfortable in defining itself as the first victim of National Socialism. A view that certainly holds true for those that were persecuted. However, those who gathered in their tens of thousands to greet Adolf Hitler on the streets in March 1938 were for sure everything but victims. Those who passively stood by or even participated when their neighbors were robbed, expelled and murdered were surely no victims. And those who proved themselves entirely indifferent towards the terrible machinery of racial mass murder may in no way claim for themselves to have been victims. To remember this means to admit to this truth. We all, representatives of governments, as much as members of parliament and lawmakers are called upon to immunize our societies against the poisons of anti-Semitism. And in doing so, we need to be aware of the fact that anti-Semitism goes beyond common racism. Anti-Semitism goes beyond racism because it reduces the Jew per se to the absolute antithesis of anything good. We need to understand that anti-Semitism is not simply directed against any particular aspects of being Jewish, but it is fundamental and it is existential. Ultimately, therefore, anti-Semitism will always strive towards extermination. For this reason, there cannot be any compromise in dealing with anti-Semitism. Ladies and gentlemen, as a speaker for Austria, I have to say that it took us a very long time to be open and honest about our past. Acknowledging this fact compels us all the more to be open and honest about our present and future. As Speaker of the Austrian Parliament, I have thus commissioned a comprehensive public opinion survey on anti-Semitism in 2019. A survey that will be repeated every 2 years. The result of the year 2019 confronts us with our reality. Today, 75 years after the end of the Shoah, we have to realize that there are still 10% of our population holding clearly anti-Semitic beliefs, as the Rebbe of Hungary mentioned in his country. An additional 30% who foster latently anti-Semitic perceptions. Alarmingly, these figures are significantly higher, towards 50, 60 and more percent among Muslim migrants, among communities of Arab and Turkish origin. In light of this, Austria has identified 3 policy fields on a national level: commemoration, research and education, and finally, very rigidly, criminalization. In the coming years, the Austrian Parliament will strengthen its role with regard to Shoah commemoration significantly, as we intend to assemble all relevant institutions, museums and memorials under our responsibility and ensure long-term public financing for these institutions. For the same degree, we will intensify our efforts in developing research and education in this field. While continuing our biannual national-wide survey on anti-Semitism, we have decided to create an independent institute at the Austrian Academy of Science, dedicated solely to research on anti-Semitism, anti-Judaism, as well as anti-Zionism. We will also be complementing these efforts by developing new concepts of Holocaust education. In addition, we wish to promote role models. Thus, the Austrian Parliament, with permission of the Wiesenthal family, will create an annual Simon Wiesenthal Award to be afforded to individuals of outstanding engagement in the fight against anti-Semitism on a national and an international level. Finally, we strongly feel that we also have to draw red lines. As an open and democratic society, we cannot and we will not accept that liberty we ensure for all is abused by radical groups to aggressively attack the basic and fundamental rights of any other member of our society. Austria will therefore evaluate its criminal law and develop more rigid punitive measures against hate speech, defamation, as well as the glorification of Nazism. Austria, I dare say, never in its past war history has confronted these issues so openly and honestly as we are doing today. Yet it would be dangerous to be complacent as we see ourselves confronted with new forms of anti-Semitism. New forms that come in the guise of anti-Zionism. Clearly, Israel, like any other state, is not above the law. And rightfully, its politics may be subject to scrutiny and criticism. However, more often than not, we have to witness how Israel is regularly demonized by international NGO campaigns, as well as in various formats of the United Nations. Just one example. The international NGO Human Rights Watch, during the past 2 months, has accused Israel 50 times of human rights violations. During the same period of time, they had nothing to say about the situation in North Korea, Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, Syria, or Iran, or Iraq. The same pattern of behavior can be seen in the UN General Assembly. These facts make very clear Israel is not treated like any other state. Israel is being singled out. And this is nothing more and nothing less than outright anti-Semitism. Austria, therefore, has committed itself to stand up against such initiatives that pretend to be concerned about human rights. Being Jews want to achieve nothing less than delegitimizing the state of Israel. As a response, our parliament next month is set up to adopt a resolution in support for the state of Israel and condemning anti-Semitic movements such as BDS. As much as all these initiatives may achieve, there is one indispensable human quality we need to encourage in our day-to-day work, in the way we represent ourselves as politicians, and in the messages we deliver, and this is common human decency. We need to cooperate on a European level and close our ranks against all forms of anti-Semitism and towards any direction it may come from. Gatherings like today are a welcome opportunity to intensify our cooperation, and I wish to thank Rav Magolin and the European Jewish Association for the initiative. Never again may we permanent our societies to surrender themselves to evil. And in doing so, may we never feel small, helpless, and overwhelmed. Thank you.
Thank you, President, for that inspiring speech. We're going to move straight to our next panel, so I would like to thank our guests once again. Our next panel, ladies and gentlemen, is called Anti-Semitism Today. And I would like to invite up to the stage from the Fundamental Rights Agency, the Director Michael O'Flaherty, from the Rabbinical Center of Europe, Chief Rabbi Benjamin Jacobs of the Netherlands, and a special guest who's flown in from Israel, the granddaughter of Mireille Knoll, who some of you will know was murdered in her Paris flat in March 2018, and we're delighted and honored to have her with us today. So we can start the second panel. From the Fundamental Rights Agency, the director, Michael O'Flaherty. The Fundamental Rights Agency, as many of you will know, has been tasked by the Commission to analyze fundamental rights across the EU and also collate information regarding anti-Semitism and produce reports. The director has done sterling efforts on this, and I invite him to address our symposium. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Excellencies, honourable members of Parliament, dear rabbis, ladies and gentlemen. Once again, we gather to commemorate the liberation of the Auschwitz extermination camp, to honour and to remember its victims, victims of the Holocaust. The Holocaust, without any doubt, is the darkest chapter in our European history. And it's so very troubling, as we've already heard this afternoon, to see that its memory is fading in our societies. And with this fading, there's a real risk that never again becomes a hollow phrase. And we simply cannot let that happen. We cannot let it pass that Jewish people in Europe continue to face streams of vile abuse on the streets and online. We cannot let it pass that many Jewish people in the EU are considering emigrating because they do not feel safe as Jews in their own countries. We cannot let it pass that Jewish places of worship and cultural sites have to be protected by heavily armed guards. And yet, these are some of the deeply worrying findings of last year's survey by my agency on the daily experience of Jewish people across the EU. The findings show that anti-Semitic hate speech, harassment and violence, the fear of merely being recognized as a Jew, are part of the reality for Jewish people across our countries. Some 90% of Jews in the EU feel that anti-Semitism is the greatest problem in their lives and that it's growing in their country. The same proportion report that anti-Semitism is a particular problem online, while about 70% cite public spaces, the media and politics as the common location of the attacks. Anti-Semitism appears to be so deeply rooted in society that for many Jewish people, regular harassment and even violence has become part of everyday life. Most incidents are not reported to the police or to any other body. Dear friends, like everyone else, Jewish people have a right to live in dignity, free from hate and without fear for their safety. We all have a duty to make this a reality. States must take urgent and immediate action to support Jewish communities, to tackle anti-Semitism effectively and lastingly. And in doing so, our states need to work closely with a broad range of partners, including in particular Jewish communities and civil society organizations. This includes strengthening Holocaust education and awareness raising. It involves keeping Jewish communities and their sites safe, and regularly and systematically monitoring anti-Semitic incidents, including through applying the working definition of anti-Semitism adopted by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. This IHRA definition provides us with valuable guidance to identify anti-Semitism. It is encouraging that all member states of the European Union have committed themselves to the definition. Another important thing we all need to do is to celebrate Jewish life, to acknowledge the immense contribution of Judaism to Europe. we have to recognize that Jews are integral to the fabric of our European Union, and Jewish culture enriches everyone. In closing, allow me to highlight 3 concrete steps that authorities should take to combat anti-Semitism. First of all, it is not enough to fight anti-Semitism, we must prevent it. Holocaust education in schools, certainly, and as we've heard already, but also training of public officials are vital prevention measures to raise awareness of what constitutes anti-Semitism and what its impact is on Jewish people and their communities. And of course, systematic evaluation of the effectiveness of preventive measures need to be built into their development. Second of my 3, but no less important, is the security and the protection of Jewish sites, community buildings, and schools. Authorities need to work closely with Jewish communities to ensure that their needs are met. This includes ensuring that Jewish security organizations receive appropriate funding. Jewish communities cannot and should not be asked to use any part of their own funds for their security. The state has a duty to protect its citizens. Third, law enforcement must find ways to encourage victims of anti-Semitism to report incidents to the authorities. This will send a strong message that the state acknowledges the seriousness of anti-Semitism and that it stands by and with the Jewish communities. Dear friends, in finishing, let me reiterate the unwavering commitment of the EU Fundamental Rights Agency to combat anti-Semitism in all its forms. In this work, we will cooperate closely with EU institutions, national authorities, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, and Jewish communities across our states. Dear friends, the stakes could not be higher. If Europe fails its Jewish communities, then Europe will have failed. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. O'Flaherty. There's another member of this panel, and I'm delighted to welcome onto the stage from the French Senate. He's the Vice Chair of European Affairs Committee, Senator André Gattolin. So for our next speaker, if I may, it's from the Rabbinical Center of Europe, a dear friend of the EGA and the APL, Chief Rabbi Benjamin Jacobs from the Netherlands, who's going to share with the symposium his experiences of anti-Semitism today. Chief Rabbi, thank you.
A bishop called upon his congregation to start a pogrom in the Jewish ghetto. His followers were allowed to steal, to hurt, to kill. But being a religious man, he gave the Jews an escape. There would be a contest between a priest and a volunteer of the Jewish community. If the Jew would win the contest, a pogrom would not take place. How did he propose the contest would take place? There would be a long table. On one side, we place the priest, and on the other side, the Jew. On both sides would be tribunes for the public. Behind the priest and behind the Jew would be standing a soldier with a sword. The Jew and the priest were open to question each other on any chosen subject. When one of them would answer clearly, "I don't know," that would be the sign for the soldier to chop off the head. As you might understand, there were not many volunteers between the Jews to join this attractive contest. But finally, on the last possible day, a shlemazel, a poor and a little bit foolish fellow, told the community that he is prepared to join the contest. Since nobody else was prepared to join this dangerous operation, they sent him as their candidate. After throwing the dice, the Jew was allowed to ask the first question to the priest. what means, he asked, Ani lo yodea. The priest, who spoke Hebrew very well, answered the correct translation, I don't know. The soldier, not knowing, of course, Hebrew, just heard, I don't know, and immediately he chopped the priest's head. The Jewish community danced for days from happiness. But after a few days, they came to the realization that something illogical had occurred. How was it possible that this simpleton had such a brilliant idea? He of course knew that the priest would know Hebrew very well, and at the same time, he of course knew that the soldier didn't. They called him over and asked him from where he took this great idea. Brilliant. And his answer was like this. I once read a book, and in the book was written, Ani lo yodea, and I didn't know the meaning. So I went to my rabbi and asked my rabbi, Rabbi, what means Ani lo yodea? And my rabbi answered, I don't know. Well, if my rabbi doesn't know, for sure the priest wouldn't know. Why did I dare to start this serious symposium with a joke? Because anti-Semitism